And in a little while, we're going to watch some more video stuff where it talks about the strength of bone and muscles and things like that. But bone has some flexibility to it. So it can flex before it's going to break. It can absorb a lot of force. So basically, the skeleton is going to form a rigid structure where all the muscles are going to attach to it. And it's going to protect other bodies' tissues. And then it's a system of levers that are acted upon by muscle. The bone's not going to move by itself. You have to have the contractile tissue to move it. And then again, here it gets into more of what's the inorganic compounds, which is going to be calcium carbonate, phosphate. That gives the bone its stiffness. But at the same time, you have the organic part, which is the different fibers, that's going to give it some strength, but also flexibility. And then there's going to be water in the bone, 25 to 30%. And that's going to contribute to the strength of the bone as well. And then you have different types of bones depending on what part of the skeleton that they're in. You have the axial skeleton, and what is that made up of? So yeah, the skull, the spine, and the rib cage. That would include the sacrum, but not the pelvis. So then for the appendicular skeleton, you have the pelvic girdle and the lower extremity, you have the shoulder girdle and the upper extremity. And then you have different short bones like the carpals and tarsals, then you have long bones. And then there's different irregular shaped bones like the bones of the vertebra. And long bones. Okay. So then you have bone metabolism, or bone homeostasis. So the skeleton is a storage bank for calcium. And in some situations, the body's going to need to draw that calcium out of the bone to get it into the blood. And in other situations, it's going to take it out of the blood and put it back into the bone. So you can have situations where you have hypertrophy or increased bone mass. And the body, the skeleton, can rebuild itself based on what forces that are applied to it. So if you have more force onto your bones are going to be stronger. So that's why they talk about doing weight-bearing exercises to help maintain bone mass, to prevent osteoporosis for females. But the thing is, you don't want to wait until your bones are weak before you start doing that. You need to keep doing exercises to maintain your bone mass, starting in the 20s, 30s, in those ages, instead of waiting until it gets decreased bone mass. So basically, you can have hypertrophy where there's increase of calcium and mineralization, and then you have atrophy, which is going to be either osteopenia or osteoporosis, where you're losing bone density. And then you have cartilage. Okay? Bones have a lot of blood supply to them. They're vascular. And cartilage is avascular. So you're going to have cartilage, which is going to cover the articular surfaces of the bone, but then you also have fibrocartilage, like the discs. Okay? Does anybody know what the largest structure in the body that's avascular?
No.
Okay. Well, what do they just say is avascular? It's cartilage, right? How about if you talk about the size of your discs, which one's going to be the largest disc? The one on the bottom, yeah. So your lumbar disc, like L5S1, is going to be the largest structure in your body that's avascular. Because it's not just the thin layer of cartilage that covers the ends of the bones. It's a fibrocartilage disc, so it's thicker. And the way that cartilage is going to get its blood supply is from the tissue adjacent to it. So it's going to get it from the bone and the periosteum, the perichondrium. And your discs are going to get nutrients pumped in and out of them from movement. So that's why when you start having degenerative joint disease and your bones, your joints stiffen up, they're going to have decreased mobility, so then they're going to have less exchange of nutrients, which is going to accentuate the fact of the degeneration. So there's things that you can do, exercises to keep the fluid pumping in your discs. So it's called imbibition, where the fluid is being pumped in and out of the cartilage. Because you have different types of cartilage. You have hyaline cartilage, which is the most common one, and that's basically when you look at a joint surface, is that white cartilage surface that actually articulates. And then you're going to have fibrocartilage, and that's where you're separating hyaline cartilage from other connective tissue. And then elastic cartilage, those are going to be things like in the external ear. Okay, that's going to have more elasticity to it. And that's, the elastic fibers are going to be more yellow, and then the other fibers are more white. So yellow cartilage would be something that's more flexible. What's that? Just the nature of the chemical makeup of it. Like you have the ligamentum flavum between the lamina and the spine. That's called the yellow ligament, so that's going to be more elastic than some of the other ligaments. So then, another thing with the inert tissue, you're going to have the joint capsule. So you have the two articular surfaces of the joint lined with cartilage. Then you're going to have the joint capsule, and that's a sac that covers around it. Okay, so it's a fibrous connective tissue, and it has two different layers. The outer layer is going to be a dense, irregular connective tissue. You remember the difference? So some of this stuff is going back to when you studied anatomy, right? Mm-hmm. It's like we do that thing where you remember in Wayne's World, you go, it's like going back in time, right? Remember back when you studied anatomy and you talked about connective tissue and things like that, right? So now we're going back in time. So you have a difference between dense, irregular connective tissue and dense, regular connective tissue. Okay, so dense, irregular would be where the fibers just run every which way like that. And that's going to be tissues where all you need to do is cover around something like a sheet. So that's going to be like a joint capsule. Versus if you have a tendon or a ligament, okay, so that's going to be more dense, regular connective tissue. Because that has to withstand force. So those fibers are going to line up with the lines of force. So if you have a ligament, all the connective tissue fibers are going to be lined up together, and that's dense, regular connective tissue versus dense, irregular. Because in a joint capsule, all we're talking about is just covering the joint. And then the inner layer is the synovium, and that's what actually is in contact with the fluid-filled part of the joint. Okay? And then that inner layer is going to secrete the synovial fluid, which lines the joint. And then that's going to lubricate the joint, and then that's where the joint surface is going to get its nutrition from movement of the synovial fluid. Okay, so basically what the joint capsule is it's a sleeve that surrounds the cell, and it contains that synovial membrane, fluid. Okay? And then there's going to be certain parts of the joint capsule that are going to be thickened, the parts that need to be stronger. So like if you have, when we talk about the shoulder joint capsule, there's thickening of that joint capsule that actually form the ligaments on the front part of the shoulder. Okay? In some cases, there's actual separate ligaments, like in the knee, where you have to talk about the cruciates, intercruciate, MCL, ACL, things like that, where those are separate, distinct ligaments. Other times it can be just a thickening of a joint capsule. And those thickenings are the points where it needs to be the strongest. All right, so now we're still talking about inert tissues, now we're talking about ligaments. Okay? And what do ligaments connect?
Bone to bone.
Bone to bone. The tendons go between bone and muscle. Okay. So basically ligaments are going to be collagen fibers, and again, they're going to be the dense, regular types of fibers. Okay, so those are going to be along the lines of force. And they're going to be bundles of collagen fibers. And it's going to stabilize the joint. So it's passive stabilization of the joint because it's inert tissue, right? So active stabilization would be something like a muscle that's stabilizing the joint. Right? Like you have a rotator cuff in the shoulder that helps hold the humerus into the joint. So it's going to resist tensile forces, it's going to resist excessive movement of the joint. So the ligament's going to hold the joint together, keep it from being sloppy and moving around too much.